I can't tell what's real. I have what's called maladaptive daydreaming, and it is simultaneously the greatest thing in my life, but also a living nightmare. Here's how it nearly killed me. Everything started when I was 10 years old. I was at the end of my primary education, and I remember being almost too excited. And this was when my maladaptive daydreaming began to take flight. It started off with small things, like listening to music in the car and imagining myself as a fairy or wizard. It was just so much fun to see myself that way. During this time, I was into fantasy cartoons and shows, and I would imagine myself like the characters in the show, like Hermione from Harry Potter, or one of the magical fairies from Winx Club. This was never anything to be worried about, but maladaptive daydreaming is thought to start with trauma. And boy, was I going through a lot at the time. My grandmother had passed away, my mom and dad split up, and one of my relatives was taken away from me. This was what started my will to escape reality, what started it all. This was a slow start. For the next year, I would simply daydream in the car. Nothing bad, right? I was wrong. I was 12 years old, and I just about to go into 8th grade when I began getting bullied. This was for things like the people I chose to hang out with and how I acted with my anxiety. Things like leaving during the middle of classes and getting angry quickly made people realize it was easy to make me cry or get a reaction out of me. This, and the death of 2 other relatives, is what really kicked my daydreaming up a notch. I began to run and pace around my room daydreaming. As I would pace around for who knows how long, seeing vivid images in my head, images I thought could have been real. It wasn't just abstract thoughts. It was like watching a video in my mind. At this point, it was only pacing, but the line between reality and fantasy was blurring. And with the bullying and more misfortune in the family, it would get worse. It could only get worse. And then I was 14. This was when my daydreaming began intruding into my real life, more so than before. Repeatedly, I was told I looked like a psychopath, restlessly pacing around the room, and that obviously didn't help. So that's when more symptoms came into play. I began to hear my characters, the one in my daydreams, talking into my ears. I saw them in my mind. I began to speak out loud and recite what they said. Soon, these daydreams began influencing me more than I was influencing them. If the person in my head was smiling, I would smile too. If they began crying, I would begin crying. In this battle against maladaptive daydreaming, I was clearly losing. I watched them like a cinema in my mind in different storylines that moved about far too fast. One minute, they were secret agents working for the CIA, and the next minute, they were students studying for an exam. Very soon, I didn't even need to pace for the daydreams to take over. I began to drift off into daydreams anywhere and everywhere. At home, in class, on the bus, and my friends would notice my little mannerisms when I daydreamed, like having exaggerated smiles. I would do things like pout my lips, and I would pull on my fingers, and sometimes I would whisper what my characters were saying, regardless of whether it made sense or not. I was never able to pay attention to anything. It was like having too many tabs open, except all the tabs were playing different videos, while I tried to sing along to the music playing in one of them. But one night, I couldn't daydream. It was impossible. I paced around my room trying to daydream, but I couldn't. And then, I began to have a panic attack. What if I can never daydream again? What about my characters? They'll die! They'll disappear! I ran into my mom's room and began crying, yelling at her, I can't daydream! It won't let me daydream! My mom wasn't sure what to do. She calmed me down eventually, and I began to realize how much I depended on my daydreaming. Everything was getting too much, too overwhelming for me. I was depressed and anxious. I felt I couldn't escape from this reality. I became obsessed with the world inside my mind. I had had enough. If I couldn't live in that world, and if I had to deal with this reality, I wouldn't do either. In January of this year, I made the decision to try to end my life. I used a prescription I had gotten for my anxiety and took as much as possible. At first, I felt nothing and thought it hadn't worked. I didn't tell my parents and went to school. Then I felt it. It was first period, and every organ in my body felt like it had been forcibly twisted the wrong way. Instantly, my friend took me to the medical room, where the school called my parents after I told them what I had done. Before I knew it, I was taken to ER and monitored. It took me a while, but all of a sudden, I saw them. There they were! My characters! They were going through the same thing I was, anxious and desperate in this unfamiliar room. And knowing we were all in the same situation, I felt a strange sense of comfort. Now all I wanted was to go back into this fantastical world I called home before my daydream stopped forever. But I was tied down with wires and heart monitors whose beeping sounded more and more like a ticking clock, urging me to go back before the doors closed in my face. The characters I imagined were slightly different now. They looked more like me. In my mind, they were laying on a hospital bed with brown, scraggy hair and sunken blue eyes. Honestly, it was like looking into a mirror, or 7 mirrors. My mother was devastated, that I could tell. I tried my best to make her feel better because of how guilty I felt. I joked that the clip on my finger was a new Gucci fashion trend, but no matter what I did, she was still gravely upset, and I couldn't fix that no matter how hard I tried. And who could blame her? Her daughter just attempted to take her own life. And her reaction, how real it compared to anything else in that room, was the real wake-up call. For the sake of the family I had left, even though I didn't want it, I needed to get help. I'm 15 now, almost 16, and I am slowly getting better. No one really knows how to help solve maladaptive daydreaming, and honestly, I'm not sure I even want to get rid of it. It might take years for me, but for now, it helps me cope with my trauma, and it's become less of a handicap and more of a tool I've learned to control. What I do know is that my condition is an odd one. On one hand, I love to daydream and pace about in my room, but on the other hand, I understand there's a point where it gets too far, and I need to grasp better control of myself. If I can't help myself, I just hope this story can help others in a similar situation.